In this President's Day in the 4K HDR Summit, it's an honor to say hello again, like last year, to the President of Inside Media and Executive Director of the 8K Association, Chris Kinnett. Hello, Chris.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure again. We are expecting to know what's going on in the 8K ecosystem and all your improvements and what is the new things in this 12 months.
I will try to give you an update.
Okay, go ahead.
So as the introduction, your kind introduction suggested, my title of the presentation is an update on 8K. So let me get started. So from an outline, I thought I would break this into 4 sections. We'll talk very briefly about the applications. We'll try and do a summary of kind of the status of the 8K ecosystem. Talk about some of the latest demos that were done over the last year, and then give you a quick update on the 8K Association activities. So let's talk about applications. So I think these 4 applications are probably the most that are talked about regarding 8K. Entertainment, of course, is the most important one. People think about, you know, movies and other entertainment-related content. And that clearly has the most significant value long-term, I think. But we need to get streaming services in place to be able to support that application, and we're not there yet. Sports has primarily been the venue that's been used to demonstrate the value proposition for 8K over the last number of years. You know, with Olympics and World Cup events. Those have been primary showcases for showing what 8K can bring to audiences. But let's not forget about user-generated content as well. If you think about it, most of the premium smartphones that are out there today support 8K video recording applications, and almost any smartphone has the capability to capture 8K still images. So just being able to play that content on an 8K TV is a value proposition for many consumers today. Gaming, of course, is a huge market and a great opportunity. And the Xbox X10 series and the PS5 both are going to support 8K. They've talked about their support for 8K for over a year. But they have yet to issue the software updates to actually do that. I think that's coming fairly soon. They've been fairly secretive about that, but we're also starting to see some games with first games have been authored now in 8K. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. You need the games in 8K to be able to really turn on that capability in the consoles. But there are lots of other applications where 8K is also important. Medical, did you realize that there are actually 8K endoscopes out there today? So there's real opportunities to do that there. Much better visualization there is very important. Security seems obvious as well. Again, there are 8K security cameras out there, so that zooming and extra resolution can be very important for many markets where security is important. Museums, being able to show high fidelity images of artifacts or art pieces of art without actually having to have people touch them or be too close to them is a value proposition for those applications. Visualization, think of scientific visualizations of atoms or universes or physics or fluid dynamics. All have higher fidelity and can be modeled with higher fidelity and displayed in 8K. So, and I kind of lump that with simulation as well. So simulation would be, for example, a flight simulator. Clearly more fidelity there is important. Remote inspection, we've seen people putting 8K cameras on drones, so you could inspect utility lines, for example, or electrical lines something with high fidelity that you can't really get today very easily. And corporate lobbies obviously will want to impress people with their 8K signage. And finally, video walls. Think about all those large digital signage canvases that are out there, many of them well beyond 8K in resolution. So just capturing 8K content and putting that up there, starting with a higher fidelity master, makes a lot of sense. So the main point of this here is there's a lot of applications for the capture, production, and display of 8K content beyond what we traditionally think might be, just VOD movies, for example. So let's jump into the status a little bit here. So let's review some of the basics of the benefits of 8K capture. And to be clear, in the 8K Association, we don't need to insist that everything that's captured in 8K is finished and distributed in 8K. If it's captured in 8K, that's fine. That's a great starting point because there are clearly lots of benefits just by starting with a higher resolution capture. So, for example, in sports, they've talked about having that high center field camera, if you will, that can capture the entire pitch or the sporting field, allowing you to do much finer zooms and or capture, even eliminate some camera positions. And that's been shown quite a bit. But there's also the ability to now do live 2K or 4K cutouts, this kind of region of interest. So you can kind of software define where a region of interest is in this 8K canvas and track a player or track a ball and have that go direct to air. Again, potentially eliminating camera positions. You can also do pan and scan, both for file-based applications for movies and TV, or even for live in that case. And when you actually capture an 8K and produce a lower resolution deliverable, that's going to create a lower noise content as well. So there's a fidelity improvement in terms of the noise level, but it's also, it's quite clear, and it's been proven many times, that capturing at a higher resolution and finishing even at lower resolution produces a better lower resolution master than if you had captured and finished at that lower resolution. Finally, a lot of productions also hire a still camera photographer who will capture still images that might be used for commercials or for other signage applications. But now if you're capturing with an 8K camera, you actually have enough fidelity in those video images that you can create stills from that. So potentially eliminating the hiring of a photographer on a production, for example. And that extra fidelity is really beneficial if you are going to involve visual effects. It's much easier to define those edges and create plates if you've got that higher resolution. And finally, of course, you're just future-proofing. So 8K cameras are here. We've got a lot of cinema-grade cameras from a number of well-known brands that are out there. We've got broadcast-grade cameras from multiple Japanese companies. Of course, as you know, NHK has been broadcasting for almost 2 years now, and actually, so they know how to put together content, and they're using these cameras, both types of cameras, on a regular basis. There are consumer-grade cameras now. Sharp, Canon, Bosma, others. These are going to be more 8K, 30 frames per second grade cameras at this point. But they kind of fit that prosumer consumer range right now with much lower price points. And as I mentioned, 8K cameras are in smartphones already. So I think, this user-generated content from the consumer grade and the smartphones is going to be a pretty interesting source of content going forward. And we all know we need content. I mean, this is going to drive the market eventually. And there's certainly a dearth of native 8K content. We acknowledge that. So I think, you know, these user-generated content can be very important. And we're seeing the natural evolution of these cameras in terms of price and performance. Every year sees this performance increase, and sometimes the costs come down as well. So all good news, all moving in the right direction. For production, the workflows are clearly there for both live and offline production today. Very few of that content is being finished in 8K today. We acknowledge that it's mostly in 4K and 2K, but the workflows are essentially the same. So you don't really have to invent anything new if you want to finish in 8K. Major editing and grading applications are out there today. Just this last week, Apple announced their MacBook Pro, which include two versions with the M1 Pro and the Max chips that offer very powerful editing capabilities, and much more so than the first version of the MacBook Pro with the M1 chip. And they've upgraded and talked about prominently the capabilities of Final Cut Pro will offer with these new MacBooks, and DaVinci Resolve is also runs very well. So this is, I think, pretty important. Now, Apple doesn't control the production pipeline, of course, but they're a key player here. And when they get on board and recognize that 8K is coming, and they produce the hardware and the software to support it, that's a pretty good sign that, you know, we're moving toward the finish line here. You do need higher end CPU and GPUs, but again, the trend here is to move those in they're always advancing, so this will become easier and easier to do going forward. Storage and infrastructure, of course, needs to be upgraded and to support the higher bandwidths and the larger file sizes. But all of these things I just mentioned is very similar to where the ecosystem was for 4K 6, 7, 8 years ago. And those problems were essentially solved, and 4K can now be done quite routinely, certainly for offline. It still remains a little more challenging in the broadcast environment. But I think the similarities are unmistakable at this point. Codecs. So we're in a unique kind of world right now in terms of codecs. Historically, it's been a single codec that's dominated. Now we have multiple codecs that are emerging simultaneously that can help solve not only the 8K problem, but video distribution in general. So for 8K today, HEVC at around 80 megabits is the baseline. Which may sound like a lot, and it is a lot compared to conventional video distribution, but also realize that many households now can get 1 gigabit per second cable service. So supporting 80 megabits with 500 megabits or a 1 gigabit service is not unreasonable today. So households and the infrastructure can actually support this. But we will still see this 80 megabits come down quite a bit over the next few years, I'm sure. AV1, of course, is out there as a viable competitor for HEVC, probably going to start in the VOD market, although I know they want to try and introduce this into the broadcast market as well. We're starting to see demos of VVC for 8K. We've been reporting on that with our 8K Association newsletter. And that will probably see more commercial introductions in 2022 with the promise to reduce those bit rates on the order of 40% for comparable quality compared to HEVC. And let's not forget about the China market, where we have a completely, a whole nother codec, the AVS3 codec, which is roughly comparable to VVC, which will dominate the China market. And we've got EVC kind of in the background there as well. But there's a lot more going on here than just the codecs. There's a lot happening in what I'll just call for a broad category of AI-assisted encoding. So there are things like what Harmonic has been developing, which they call content-aware encoding, which continuously looks at the video quality in real time and focuses bits where and when they matter most for the viewer. So that's taking in human visual perception into the decisions that are made by the encoder. And maybe you can save up to 40% if you use this kind of algorithm to reduce the bit rate. Now it's going to be content dependent. And a lot of these things I'm going to talk about are going to be content dependent. So you can't blanket apply these to every piece of content and expect all these things to work. So dynamic resolution encoding is a way to adjust that bit rate ladder that's often done for VOD, but to do it now for live encoding applications. Again, a way to reduce to optimize those encode bit rates for a live application, something that's typically done for VOD. Dynamic frame rate encoding now says, let's look at the movement that's happening in the video content, and we will encode at the frame rate that makes sense for that content. So live sports where there's a lot of action, you're not going to be able to do much in terms of dynamic frame rate encoding. But if it's talking heads like me giving this presentation, you don't necessarily need 60 frames per second. You can probably do it at a much lower frame rate and save bits. We've also got this category, let's call it scalable encoding, where you can have a base layer encode. If we're talking 4K, an 8K application, your base layer would be at 4K resolution, and your enhancement layer would add additional information to allow an 8K signal to be properly rendered on an 8K display. And those two bits, the base layer and the enhancement layer, don't necessarily have to go over the same transports mechanism as well. So one could be broadcast and one could be over the top or internet delivered, for example, and they would be synchronized by the receiver. So this is kind of another way to get to an 8K streaming service. You just basically have a 4K streaming service plus an enhancement layer if you have an 8K TV. And these schemes are also codec agnostic. So you can now start to mix and match some of these AI assisted things I've talked about with these various codecs. So there's lots of levers that the distribution companies can start to play with here to optimize the delivery and reduce the bit rates to do that. And we've got this potential thing called smart streaming as well, which is kind of a variation here where you start with an 8K master, you downscale it to 4K and distribute it as 4K with some kind of metadata and allow the TV to smartly upscale that to a guided upscale, if you will. So, and summarizing some of these distribution situations here, HEVC and AV1 will start with the 8K distribution. I think VVC will follow to 2022, 2023, and gain more credence as it becomes more widely adopted. Smart streaming, AI assisted, and the layered approaches will allow lots of flexibility here. There will be kind of a mix and match approach, but it will be content dependent on the gains that you can achieve here. So satellite and over-the-air distribution, I think, are not, in our opinion, not the best near-term options, but they may be interesting longer-term options. The 5G delivery option has been talked about a lot for 8K, and I think it makes sense in some applications, but it only makes sense when you talk about the millimeter wave options. And I think if you're talking on the for consumer adoption and 8K, It's the fixed wireless access that's basically an alternative to cable distribution. But if you use millimeter wave services, you can get speeds that are up to a gigabit per second. So a very viable competitor to a cable approach, but we're still early in that cycle right now. On the other side, the cable networks are right in the middle of upgrading to a 10 gigabit per second network. And a lot of these companies are laying fiber, certainly to the node, and even some cases to the home. So as I mentioned previously, you know, consumers can get gigabit service today. And with all this activity, both by the telecom companies and with the cable network companies, you're going to see a lot more speed coming to consumers in the next 3, 4, 5 years, for sure. So I think we may see some limited streaming services of 8K content next year. But I think I'm hopeful we'll see the bigger players enter in 2023 or 24. In terms of playback, 8K TVs are well supported for 8K streaming today. They have a lot of the apps already built in. PCs can support 8K playback very easily with an advanced GPU card. We don't have any set-top boxes yet, except for what NHK is offering. But I'm hearing rumors of new set-top boxes coming probably next year. HDMI 2.1 is gaining traction and is a key element for supporting 8K 60 playback. You've got several connector types beyond HDMI 2.1, USB 4, Thunderbolt 4, DisplayPort 2.0, all having bandwidth capabilities for 8K playback. I mentioned the game consoles with their playback capabilities as well. And let's not forget about Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is an important element here too. And Wi-Fi 6 and 6E also have plenty of bandwidth, especially 6E, which is an expanded spectrum. All can support 8K streaming. So the pieces are all here for playback. Displays, we know there's plenty of 8K TVs out there from all the major brands. Distribution varies and by region, and prices are high today. There's no doubt about that. This is the tip of the spear, but we're already starting to see some of those TVs approach the $2,000 price point. And with the holiday season coming up, I think you're going to start to see some special pricing for all these TVs. So again, this is the history of displays and TVs. New products always come at high price points and drive the price down actually quite rapidly, sometimes to the detriment of those TV brands. But there's also a lot of capacity in the market today to produce flat panel displays, especially the larger sizes with these 10.5G fabs, many of which are in China. And they're optimized for 65-inch screen sizes and higher. So plus the trend for consumers to adopt larger screen sizes, all of these things favor pushing prices lower. And there's lots of new technologies out there as well that will start to drive and improve the picture performance as well. Mini LEDs, micro LEDs, etc. So let's move on to some demos that's happened. I think the main one I really want to highlight is the Olympics. So obviously the 2020 Olympics were delayed from 2020 to 2021. But NHK did deliver on their promise to broadcast it in 8K. They produced about 200 hours. That was nominally distributed. Those 200 hours are distributed in Japan only, but for the first time, a partnership between Intel, Globo, and Spin Digital, Globo, the big TV broadcaster in Latin America, they teamed together to actually stream a lot of 8K content to some special sites, some in Los Angeles and Oregon, but also into Brazil, where Globo actually live streamed many hours of 8K content on their VOD platform called Globo Play. So this was a pretty milestone event this past summer. And if you listen to what Intel is saying about this, their words are very clear. This is beyond a proof of principle at this point. This is now a viable commercial service that people can really start to consider offering an 8K streaming service, as Globo is basically doing already. So here's some of the nitty-gritty details. If you want to study these things, it talks about how all this was done. But on the Intel side, this is all cloud-based processing. They would get a contribution feed from NHK, and this would be converted and processed in the cloud on Xenon class CPUs. It was then, they would then create a distribution signal, which went out to the LA venue and the Intel headquarters at 80 megabits. They also created a contribution signal that went to Globo. Globo then reprocessed that using some bit moving encoding technology that would go out for their VOD platform. And that was also, I believe, at around at a high end of around 80 megabits as well. So again, a milestone kind of event this year. So moving on to the 8K Association. Our mission is to help educate both consumers and professionals about 8K. And we want to encourage the expansion of the 8K ecosystem beyond just media entertainment. I talked about all those applications in the beginning of this talk, and now clearly we're more focused on media and entertainment to start, but I know there's lots of other applications where that activity can actually benefit media and application and vice versa. So we also have an 8K TV logo certification program, which we think is an aid for consumers in buying their 8K TVs. If they see that logo, they should have some confidence it's a quality 8K TV. And we've got these two websites. The 8kassociation.com is kind of the more B2B or professional facing one, and then Discover 8K is more consumer facing. And both of those websites are less than a year old. In fact, we just refreshed the B2B one. So there's lots of information up there that talks about all these workflows and capture, production, distribution. So I think it becomes kind of a resource and hopefully a go-to site for many folks. Currently have 31 members and several more in which we'll be talking about soon. TV brands, panel makers, test labs, chipset providers, technology and equipment providers, and content creators. So I think you can see there's a pretty nice range of companies representing this full ecosystem. So major activities that we've kind of done in the last year or so, we've now certified over 70 TV models that are in the market today. We've launched this new weekly newsletter called the 8K Monitor. We're actually pretty proud of this. We're putting out 2 or 3 original articles every week and commenting on other articles published by trade associations or trade magazines to give you the perspective, our perspective on what this news means for the industry. As I mentioned, there are 2 websites, both of which are pretty up to date now and provide information for consumers or professionals. We'll be publishing, we have published a couple of white papers. We'll be publishing a new one soon, which will talk about the situation for 8K live workflows. we've done and will continue to do more conferences, workshops, webinars, etc. And we're working with some of the standards development organizations as well. We want to track and liaise with those as much as possible and support them in whatever way we can, which, for example, may include providing 8K content to them. One of the benefits of membership of the 8K Association is that we are sourcing native high-quality 8K content for use by our members. And finally, we've also just hired a digital marketing person who will be helping us talk more about what the 8K Association is doing, as well as the industry activities on some of the social media platforms and other platforms to help get the word out beyond our newsletter. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it was at least slightly informative.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Don't move from New York, because right now we continue in the 4K HDR Summit with the panel with the presidents of the UHD Alliance, Michael Think, UHD Forum, the new president, Nandu Nankan Madur, and you. So we will have the classic panel in the 4K Summit. See you in a moment.
Sounds good. Thank you.